So finally we come to the institutional perspective, which is one that is, surprisingly, pretty controversial in comparative international education right now. I have a whole lot of things to say about that if you're ever interested in discussing that further. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to at least pose it, because I think it has been an important way of thinking through educational equity and inequity, and ways of thinking about how ideas about that either do or don't spread worldwide. A lot of the ways that institutional approaches to comparative and international education have been sort of superficially interpreted have to do with very sort of straightforward questions like, where's the school and in which country? And it's difficult to say, right? Because a school looks like a school in many different places. We might make some assumptions based on the skin color of these students or the kinds of resources that we can see in the classroom, but this typical setup is not unusual. I mean, we have students facing forward, we have a teacher at the front, we have probably similar expectations about curriculum, etc., that we would find in this classroom in rural Kenya. Right? Again, we have the idea that people are facing forward, that there is some sort of a teacher-centered way of thinking about doing education. We have, school-aged pupils, and then teachers that are in charge of the content. There are lots of ways we could talk about bounded expectations or rationalized expectations for what is legitimate schooling, right? Which have nothing to do, by the way, with saying about what's the best way or the right way to do it. It has everything to say about what do we expect, we being the global we, out of education worldwide, and being remarkably surprised that it tends to be stable even in communities and cultures where we would expect a large amount of differentiation. A better way to think about it would be to start from scratch. What is an institution? Well, it could be any particularly large or important association. It could be an organized, established procedure. It could be a significant practice, relationship, or organization in a society or culture. But more reasonably for us, it's a social pattern that reveals a particular reproduction process like schools suggest. In other words, this has elements of functional and conflict theory embedded in it. And it's not necessarily a theory that makes, in fact, it's not at all a theory that makes judgment calls about which one of these perspectives is right. What it says is that it has a way of thinking about social patterns that align with reproduction processes. So it's both functional and conflict. Now, I've showed you names of a couple of different famous people from functionalism and conflict theory. And I don't want to talk about each of these too much, but if you are interested, you could look up some of the work by Richard Scott, who is a prolific writer in neo-institutional theory, although he doesn't do education-specific stuff. As you can tell, it's mostly related to organizations, of which education would certainly be one. There is the guy who gets the most flack from comparative and international education people, John Mayer. He wrote something way back in 1977 with Brian Rowan, which has become sort of a hallmark article in neo-institutional thought, Institutionalized Organizations, Formal Structure as Myth and Ceremony. Again, I encourage you to read it. I'm not going to summarize it here. There's DiMaggio and Powell, who have also written some pretty important work from an institutional perspective. One, DiMaggio is more of a, well, certainly he's a sociologist, but he's also a bit of an anthropologist, and he's interested in art and museums and things like that. Woody Powell is much more of an organizations guy, and they wrote something back in the 80s called The Iron Cage Revisited, where they talked about this concept of isomorphism and collective rationality, again from a very sociological perspective, and I encourage you to take a look at that if you have time. Now, a guy that we see a lot in comparative and international education is Cheeky Ramirez. He's like many of these guys, he's at Stanford. And he says, this is a quote from one of his works, "We see a push to use universal access to primary education as a key measure of both individual welfare and national development." Now, he's not saying that institutionalists are pushing to use education and access to it as a measure of welfare and development. He's saying that that is what is being observed. And that this rationalization, that individual welfare, particularly individual access to quality education, is at the very center of development. In other words, ways that development is conceived worldwide, and creates the foundation on which to build broader normative arguments for education and development. That's what it says down there, and development. All right? So the idea is that there is a rationalization about what development is related to education. Primarily, it has been focused on access for decades and decades now. And that has then become set up as a way of thinking about what development is, not just for education, but in broader society. That's an interesting thought. Think of it this way. We can look at some big statements. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26. You can find it here if you want to see the actual language beyond what I have quoted here. And just look at point 1 of Article 26. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory, blah, 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 blah. All right? This is all about access, right? So the idea that everyone has not just the right to education, but should be able to access education has become institutionalized at a global level by being part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that country after country has become a signatory to. That's interesting. If we want to look at education for all, whether you like it or hate it, it is also a way to institutionalize the idea of educational access and the ways that that access even meets diverse learning needs of everyone, whether they are sort of the typical student or not. But again, it's an access issue. Now, if we were to dive a little deeper, there are several propositions that Meyer and Rowan in 1977 pointed out related to institutionalization and organizations, and we can think about them in terms of education. And they say that as rationalized institutional rules arise in given domains of work activity, formal organizations, like schools, form and expand by incorporating these rules as structural elements, not because they are the truth, but because they provide a sense of legitimacy and rationalization. Organizations that incorporate societally legitimated, rationalized elements in their formal structures maximize their legitimacy and increase their resources and survival capabilities. In other words, those organizations that do incorporate societally legitimated, rationalized elements into their formal structures themselves become more legitimate and increase their chances of survival and resource. Every organization wants to do that. Every organization, schools included. Because attempts to control and coordinate activities in institutionalized organizations lead to conflicts and loss of legitimacy, thesis and antithesis, elements of structure are decoupled from activities and from each other. In other words, those rationalized and legitimated structural elements are going to come into conflict with the activities and the individuals who have agency at the local level. And so, for those reasons, the structure and the activities are going to become decoupled. The link is going to break between those two in certain spots. Or maybe the break is right here. The more an organization's structure is derived from institutionalized myths, by the way, myth is just a way of saying things that we believe that have become legitimate, but they don't necessarily have to be truth. The more it maintains elaborate displays of confidence, satisfaction, and good faith, both internally and externally. Okay? So, for example, this image here, thank you for being such a wonderful teacher, and the innocent child with the writing and the chalkboard. I mean, this is all part of the institutionalized, idealized myth of education, that it is kids of this age who are learning how to read and write, that they're thankful, and they talk about how wonderful it is to be a part of the education system, so that there's this real amelioration, this progress that's sort of perceived and rationalized as part of education. All of this is going to be a display of confidence, satisfaction, and good faith in the school system, even though its legitimacy may come from institutionalized myths about what it can and can't do. So that's some of the pinning behind that. Now, what does it actually look like? Well, there are ways of talking about what education is that have to do with scripts and models, and we've talked about that before in this class. Certainly you've talked about that in other classes. But what are some of the ways that we think about doing education? If you were going to set up a school tomorrow in a disadvantaged community somewhere near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, what would be the model that you would use? I dare to say that it is a model we would recognize. As crazy and as off the wall as you think it can be or should be, it'll probably still have elements that we could recognize as school. And that is because there are expectations about what school is that have gained legitimacy for many different reasons. In other words, these are the things that we have to be able to have in order to call something a school, and it's very difficult to set it up unless it has those core elements. Now, it will never have every element, and so there will always be some loose coupling between the model and what actually happens in life, right? The activity. So there always is going to be some loose coupling here, because what happens in life and what the expectations are here is not always what happens in the models and what the expectations are there, and that's okay. We just recognize that. But we do have a couple of assertions. One is that social institutions like schools profoundly construct the way life is organized. Profoundly. Because it sets a set of legitimized expectations and puts them into the institutionalized structure of schools in a way that those expectations then become realized often through the fact that they are embedded in the schools. It doesn't mean that a perfect world exists. It doesn't mean that homogeneity is achieved. What it means is that the institutionalized structure, the formal rules and policies, the way that we think about schooling as normal or legitimate is going to profoundly influence the way that we organize our lives. It's difficult to get a job without an education. It's difficult to understand how to read and write without an education. It's difficult to do most things in life without some sort of education. Next. Mass schooling sets the stage for the increasing importance of education as an institution. The importance of educational access being open to the masses worldwide is, according to an institutional perspective, one of the reasons why education is seen as being so important. If we did not have mass schooling as a phenomenon worldwide, we would not see education being this set up as an important institution. But because it is, education increasingly dominates the structure of childhood and child rearing. Children without formal schooling as part of their growing up experience are not considered to be the same as children who do have that as part of their experience. We talked about this before in many ways, but remember, if you don't have an education background, you have been part of dehumanization. You have been taken out of the human category because you have not experienced one of the fundamental experiences that a person can have of formal education. Now, I'm not saying that's right. What I'm saying is that that's what exists. And so did Freire, and so did Illich, and so did a lot of other people. Finally, how does change or growth take place according to institutional theory? Well, it can be forced, it can be copied, or it can be normative. In other words, it just gets reproduced that way over and over again until it becomes legitimate. Now, what is isomorphism? It's a constraining process that forces one unit in the population to resemble other units that face the same set of environmental conditions. Does this mean homogeneity? No, it does not. Does it mean that there will be things that change to look more like each other over time in places where you wouldn't expect it? Yes. Do they ever become actually the same worldwide at the same time? No. Right? Because social units, society, are dynamic and ever-changing. We learned that from our functionalist perspective. And remember, institutional perspectives combine the functional and the conflict perspectives. Which brings us back to global elitism for our next screencast.